One of the first long-form videos I made on this channel was a unit analysis of Mercedes, where, after a very thorough investigation of her performance on a chapter-by-chapter basis, I concluded that my favorite character in Three Houses was also probably the worst unit in the cast. And I think much of what I said in that video holds up to this day. Even if given heavy favoritism, Mercedes just contributes less than Anna and Ash, who are commonly considered to be bottom tiers. But one thing I failed to factor in my analysis is just how bad some of the late joining faculty members are. Sure, Shamir and Catherine are standout units who have a place on most teams at the very least short term, and Sedith is an incredibly competent Wyvern Rider who's very close to Swift Strikes at join time. But I find this is the exception rather than the rule when it comes to church units, with the majority of the faculty failing to live up to the standards set by the student body. And so today I want to shine a spotlight on the faculty members of Three Houses and why for the most part they suck. Starting with an incredibly low-hanging fruit, let's make fun of an armor knight. Gilbert is a truly pathetic unit, and I do think there's a strong argument for him being the worst unit in the game. He's only available on the Blue Lions route, which I personally don't see a need to penalize him for. However, his availability on that route is pretty abysmal, joining partway through Chapter 13 out of 22. In a game like Three Houses, where most units are incredibly available, only being around for less than half of the game is already pretty bad, but I would say that Gilbert's availability is even worse than it appears on the surface. You see, in addition to the main chapters, there are paralogs available in both the Academy phase of Three Houses and the War phase of Three Houses. But the rewards of the paralogs in the Academy phase are generally much stronger than those available in the War phase, leading many players, myself included, to skip any War phase paralogs that they just don't feel like engaging with. If you're using a net, then the Crusher is a pretty good thing to get, I guess, although she has plenty of builds that don't take advantage of it. And the Exhaustible isn't a bad weapon, but it's just not as rewarding as something like Boots or the Thyrsus, which you would get from the Part 1 paralogs. I suspect I know the reason why Gilbert misses so many chapters, however. Both he and Dedue are locked to the Blue Lions route, and Dedue has an extended leave of absence during the beginning of the War phase. If Dedue was a big part of your team and you invested heavily into him, you might be looking for a replacement to fill his role, either temporarily or permanently. And since Dedue is modeled after the traditional Armor Knight General class, giving you a pre-trained general to sort of fill his shoes is kind of reasonable on the developer's side. At least I think this is what their intent was. In practice, of course, Dedue has a much deeper kit than Gilbert, and as a result, Gilbert might not be able to fill the Dedue-sized shape in your roster, and even putting that aside, unlike a traditional Fire Emblem game, in Three Houses, it's not unreasonable to have several benched units who keep up experience-wise thanks to the adjutant system. Even if Dedue was a core part of your fighting force, it's reasonable that you could just have someone lying around to fill his shoes anyway. I mean, heck, just one chapter before this, Sedith joins your army, and shortly before that, Alois becomes available, as well as Hanneman and Manuela. Don't worry, we'll get to the three of them. But for now, I want to focus on Annette's deadbeat dad. If you do choose to give him a slot on your team, he has a little bit to offer you. He joins with 30 defense, although 10 of that is from Fortress Knight. He only has 20 personal defense, and sends a very clear signal that what he wants to do is protection tank. The idea behind a protection tank is you get into a high defense class, you slap on a silver shield, you equip a high protection battalion, and you just hope that that's enough to stop enemies from damaging you. It is a very traditional way of enemy phasing, and in my opinion is the weakest of the three possible enemy phase options. Still, there are some people with the stats to make it work, and Gilbert is certainly one of them. It is worth noting that reclassing Gilbert to either Warrior or Paladin boosts his base speed by 6, which can help during the rough area before you get all enemies to 0 damage. And speaking of Warrior, if you want Gilbert to actually be killing the enemies that run up against his shield, you're going to want to spend some time in that class to get him Wrath, because he doesn't have access to Battalion Wrath. which really kind of sucks. Like, I already don't like protection tanking as a strategy, but at least the other protection tank candidates have Battalion Wrath. Gilbert just has a high defense stat and a high armor rank. But that armor rank does give him one more tool, and potentially it's the most valuable thing in his arsenal. Gilbert has inherent smite access. Granted, anyone can get smite if they invest in studying heavy armor, but heavy armor is one of the least desirable skills in the game. Gilbert having it for free just basically means you don't have to waste someone else's time studying a skill that doesn't do much for them. Also, it's nice that he has a good riding rank in addition to the armor rank, so he can be in a high movement class like Paladin, smite someone 2 spaces, and then that's his contribution for the map. And don't get me wrong, movement tools are nice, but Three Houses has like 1.5 million of them. Stride is on a battalion, Warp is something you can use multiple times per map at 0 cost, and Reposition is a skill that a lot of your students will just naturally pick up going through Soldier. Being able to smite and Canto is cool, but I'm sure you could find someone else to fill the role of mounted movement bot if you really need them to. I guess Gilbert also has rally defense, but I'ma be real, I think we're long past the point in the game in which rally defense justifies deploying a unit. But speaking of bad rallies, did you know that Alois has a personal skill? It's Rally Luck! Alois joins 2 chapters earlier than Gilbert, and he has 17 personal defense. Combine that with his boon in armor, and Alois is another theoretical candidate for a protection tank build. And to my mind, he is better at it than Gilbert. He has a higher base strength stat, and he starts with Battalion Wrath unlocked, meaning that you can set up guaranteed crits if he's enemy facing. Alois' personal defense base is just what Gilbert can accomplish by reclassing into Paladin or Warrior, so if they go into Fortress Knight, they're both going to be getting doubled by these same groups of enemies. Already, I'm happier with Alois than I am with Gilbert, but being better than Gilbert is a pretty low bar. Thankfully, there is one more benefit that Alois brings to the table, and that is a very easy path into Grappler. He has a based fist rank of B and a boon in the skill. Since he starts at level 21, he can just immediately gamble a certification for it. And Grappler is one of the best player phase classes in the game. Initially, it grants Fist Fair to make your brave attacks with gauntlets even stronger. But once you achieve class mastery, you gain access to Fierce Iron Fist, which is a 3-hit strike that can only be used while in the Grappler class. Given Alois' really high strength stat, he's going to be deleting anyone that he clicks this on. And that's kind of it. Don't get me wrong, it's nice that he has the ability to just delete someone basically for free, but Grappler and Sniper are kind of the classes that you put people in if they don't have anything else going for them long term. Alois isn't really making use of any of his unique talents, he is just making use of how broken the Grappler class is. You would get a similar result if you trained Caspar, Raphael, Felix, or any number of other fist-proficient characters in order to make them into a Grappler. Alois' main benefit is just that you don't have to deal with the rough mid-game many of those characters can go through. I guess it is technically worth mentioning that in addition to his personal skill, Alois has another rally available at base, that being Strength, which is admittedly a much more desirable stat than Luck. But I think at this point in the game, most of your units are going to be one-rounding all of the enemies they fight anyway, either by using broken combat arts on player phase, or abusing Wrath builds in order to crit everyone on enemy phase. It's definitely possible that an extra 4 points of damage makes the difference for a kill threshold, especially if you're using some of the Brave or Triple combat arts against monster bosses, and Alois isn't really a skill-hungry unit, so you kind of might as well put it on him just in case it comes up. But for the most part, I think he joins after the point in which any rallies are relevant. Well, except for Rally Magic, because technically that's +1 warp range, and that's kind of Hanneman's claim to fame. Rally Magic is Hanneman's personal skill, and it is arguably the best part of his kit, which is depressing because when he joins in Chapter 8, you are probably well past the time in which +4 to a stat makes a significant difference. Rally magic is probably the easiest one to justify because +4 magic means that if you use it on a warper or rescuer, they get +1 range on their movement spell. In this way, once you move out of the point where you need rallies in order to secure kills, you can think of rally magic as less of a stat boosting skill and more of a movement skill. But there are very rarely situations where +1 range on a warper is going to be worth an entire deployment slot. As I mentioned with Gilbert, Three Houses has a ton of movement tools, and you could probably find some combination of the March Ring and the Stride Gambit and various reposition combat arts that will get you what you want without having to use rally magic on Hanneman. In fact, from a strict movement perspective, Reposition and Smite both give you more tiles than Rally Magic does. Although it's not quite that simple, because Reposition and Smite are very situational. You need to be able to be right next to the person who you're either repositioning or smiting, and you might not be able to do that. You might need to warp them over a wall exactly one more square or something like that. Now, if all you're using Hanneman for is his personal skill of Rally Magic, then thankfully that makes him incredibly low investment. He has what you need at base, and you can just bench him in the maps where you don't need his Rally Magic. But if you want to make him a part of your team, he does have a couple of other tools to offer. None of them are things that I would say are particularly good, but they are worth noting, I guess. His Reason rank starts at B, and he has a boon in Reason, meaning he will very quickly get to his A+ spell, which is Meteor. Very few units in Three Houses have access to Seize magic. Aside from Hanneman, Dorothea and Anna have access to Meteor, and Hilda, Manuela, and Constance have access to Bolting. No one else has any Siege Tomes, so if you want to be able to strike enemies from far away across the map, then this is a decent option. But in general, Meteor is considered to be the worst of the two Siege Tomes. It only has one use, meaning you can only use it one time per map. The benefit that you get as a trade-off for this downside is it deals splash damage in a T shape, but personally, I find that the enemies I want to hit with Meteor just don't line up in the formations to make this work as well as it should. The splash damage is also less than the initial cast, and it isn't capable of killing. So it's not like you're going to get a huge payoff from finding the perfect T formation to hit enemies with. And you do actually have to aim for an enemy. You can't target an empty square in order to hit people in a checkerboard formation, unfortunately. As a result, if I'm going to pick a Siege Tome, I would much prefer the two uses from Bolting. Especially because with the Black Magic ×2 skill, that becomes 4, as opposed to Meteor becoming 2. Still, having access to a Siege Tome is definitely an upside. It's just a shame that the rest of his toolkit doesn't really offer anything super unique. He doesn't even have any 1-3 range spells, it's all just vanilla 1-2 range on the offensive end. And on the white magic end of things, he starts out at E, so he doesn't even have heal at base. If you're willing to train him to B, you can get Ward, but Ward isn't super valuable. No physic, no movement tools, not even silence. There's just not much for him in the white magic tree. And I get that that was supposed to put him as a counterpart to Manuela. From a flavor perspective, I do like that he focuses on black magic and she focuses on white magic, but when it comes to the toolkits, it just makes them feel worse than the students who have powerful options from both schools of magic. Considering that the mage class line is already not great in Three Houses, it kind of makes you want to lean towards another build with Hanneman. And I personally think his ideal class line as a core team member is the Sniper class. Sniper works a lot like Brawler, and then it relies on a multi-hit combat art to delete enemies on player phase. In this case, it is Hunter's Volley, which Echoes fans might be familiar with. It only hits 2 times instead of 3, so you don't get as much benefit as Fierce Iron Fist, but you can hit from a much farther range, and you're using a stronger weapon type than Fists, so it generally evens out. Because Hanneman has a proficiency in bows and access to a pretty reasonable magic stat, he can become a magic bow sniper, which is a relatively unique niche. Basically, only him and Mercedes are built for it, both with the stats and boons required. Now, I don't think that a magic bow sniper represents a significant upgrade over a physical bow one. After all, sniper bases are quite good. In fact, they are good enough for Shamir to one-round enemies on the final map of Maddening using nothing but sniper bases and Bowfair plus her Catherine Might support plus a forged silver bow. Granted, that is quite a lot of damage stacks, but it's a demonstration of how strong the class bases are on the physical end of things. But I don't think that this is actually a downside for the magical sniper build. You see, when you reclass Hanneman or Mercedes into Sniper, they get Sniper bases. Both of these characters have a Might support to take advantage of, and while it's not likely for them to get a second round of Bowfair, they can replicate it by simply proccing Strength 5 times. Which, is a thing that will happen. They don't have super high strength growth, but 25% is still going to happen a quarter of the time. What this means is that Hanneman can use physical bows to kill most enemies, and if he runs into a very high defense enemy, such as an armor knight or a boss with low resistance, he can use Hunter's Volley with the magic bow. The magic bow is much more expensive than other bows you might be using for Hunter's Volley, so you probably want to conserve it for when targets need it. And bear in mind that everything I'm saying about Sniper Hanneman can also apply to Sniper Mercedes. The only downsides of putting either of these characters into the Sniper class is that they can't access their spell pools, but neither of them have spell lists that are particularly desirable. Mercedes can use Physic in the early game, but that's before you have access to Sniper. And Hanneman Meteor is probably at its best for proccing linked attacks from 10 range away, but Hanneman doesn't have a particularly deep support pool, so that's also not going to be an incredibly relevant strategy for most teams. I guess you could build your team around his support pool, but at that point, you're kind of making Hanneman a linchpin of a team, and I just don't think he is strong enough of a character to be the linchpin of your team. For the most part, I would say that Hanneman in Sniper is very similar to Alois in Grappler. Hanneman is making use of a good class that he has an easy path to, but not really bringing too much of his own to the table. Still, I think the ability to use the magic bow is probably enough to elevate him above Alois in the I guess we're making this guy work by using a powerful class category. We do have one more, in my opinion, bad church unit to talk about, but before I reveal who it is, I need to confess something to y'all. The initial idea for this video was not simply to take some dunks on the terrible teachers at Garrick Mach's Officers Academy. I mean, sure, it's fun to tease the Armor Knight who struggles at tanking, the Rally Bot who shows up too late for rallies, or the Mage who just has a terrible spell list. But I don't think that that sort of content makes for a particularly interesting video. They're easy targets for ridicule, and almost everyone can see the core problems that they have just from a glance at their character sheet. No, when I initially pitched this video to my patrons, it was a unit analysis of just one faculty member. One who, at first glance, actually appears quite good, but who I genuinely think would struggle to contribute on most non-restricted teams. This is actually a character that I've wanted to talk about since before I did unit analyses as a series. One that I've joked about on Discord for almost a year now. And, well, I won't delay things any further. It's time for my Manuela Festo. Manuela joins as a level 15 priest alongside Hanneman in Chapter 8, and the two of them are clearly supposed to form a pair, with him focusing on offensive magic and Manuela focusing on supportive magic. She starts out with Heal, Nosferatu, Ward, and Silence. The fact that her only healing spell is, well, Heal is kind of funny and feels like a pretty significant flavor fail. Like, this is the head of the infirmary at Garrick Mach, and she's clearly not suited for that job. But this low-hanging fruit doesn't really impact her playability, After all, Chapter 8 is around the turning point where you enter the period of your units being either one-rounded or not damaged at all. There are some situations where you're going to want to heal people, and in those cases it sucks not to have Physic, but ultimately I don't hold her lack of healing spells too harshly against her. Ward is a weird addition to her toolkit. In most other Fire Emblem games, I actually think it's quite strong and typically pretty underrated. But in Three Houses, the stat inflation is so extreme that +7 resistance isn't actually going to make as much of a difference as you would like it to. Early on, Ward can potentially allow a unit to tank a mixed group of enemies, especially if they have high defense but low resistance, such as Dedue does. But Manuela joins in Chapter 8, and I think that we are exiting the early game around this point. As such, Ward has less applications. Also, a weird fact that I don't think I'll have an opportunity to talk about outside of this video is that Ward was actually nerfed in Three Houses. In most Fire Emblem games, it gives a buff of 7 resistance, decaying by 1 each turn, but in Three Houses, it decays by 2 points every turn. I'm not really sure what the reasoning for this is, and because Ward isn't particularly strong anyway, it doesn't come up too often, but it's kind of interesting. There isn't a barrier or ward equivalent in Three Houses. The closest thing we have is Soren's Reflect Staff, and that works completely differently than the traditional barrier ward. So I guess we have to wait until the theoretical Fire Emblem 18 in order to see if this is a permanent change or just a quirk of Fodlan Ward. But getting back on topic, Manuela's spell list has another piece of anti-mage tech. Silence, and I think this one is actually more useful than Ward is. Due to a bug in the game's programming, Silence will actually never miss, which means you can use it to reliably turn off a dangerous mage for 1 turn. This can be quite helpful, either for allowing your physically defensive units to tank an otherwise mixed group by turning off its only mage. Alternatively, if there are a number of dangerous enemies you need to kill, Silence can take one off the board for a turn, allowing you to focus on the other enemies that you didn't status. It is worth noting that in the late game, magical bosses typically have the commander skill, which grants them immunity from status effects, so you can't silence, for example, Meteor Hubert. But even with that limitation, I think Ward is a solid spell in any utility mage's toolkit. But the selling point of her white magic tree is the one spell that she doesn't come with at base. Manuela is one of only 4 units capable of learning Warp. She starts at B rank Faith and has a boon in the skill, so she will pretty quickly reach A in order to start warping your units. This is generally seen as her best trait, and personally I agree with that assessment. Warp is inarguably the strongest movement tool in the game, and movement tools are nice when Three Houses late game has so many maps that revolve around killing 1 or more bosses far away from your starting position. Even on the game's route maps, Warp can be helpful, either for transporting a unit into the fray or helping someone get out of danger. Although the latter application is a little bit tricky because it involves putting Manuela near them, and she's not exactly the tankiest unit in the cast. Overall though, I would say that Warp ties her white magic tree together quite nicely. It is a very good reward for reaching A rank, and she also gets a good reward for reaching A rank in the black magic tree. Bolting is her highest tier black magic spell, and like I said in the Hanneman section, bolting is quite good, either for dealing damage at a distance or setting up supports via linked attack just having it equipped. This is especially relevant if you're using Manuela purely as a utility unit. If you just want her to silence and warp people, you can leave bolting equipped and she can join in on linked attacks for anyone who she has supports with. Much like with Hanneman, her support list isn't exactly the best out there, but if you do have some units that just happen to overlap with her, it's kind of just a free upside. Well, free isn't exactly accurate, because Manuela starts at E in Reason, which is the same thing that happens with Hanneman starting in E in Faith, but Hanneman doesn't really have to climb too far to gain access to things like Heal, whereas Manuela has to climb all the way from E rank to A rank in Reason in order to make use of the only good Reason spell in her arsenal. Since she joins no sooner than Chapter 8, this on its own would already be pretty bad. But for whatever reason, Manuela actually has a Bane in Reason, meaning that she will grow in Reason twice as slow. Even on normal and hard, this means that Manuela needs intense focusing and tutoring in order to get her Reason rank to the point where she learns bolting. And this is made worse by the fact that since magic has limited uses, you can't abuse strategies like broken weapon training or skirmish battles in order to build your rank faster. On Maddening mode, it is damn near impossible to get bolting in a reasonable time frame. Like, I guess you could use it to deal chip damage on endgame from halfway across the map, but if that is the payoff to your heavy investment in a character, I feel like that investment is better served elsewhere. I genuinely do not know why they chose to give her a Bane in Reason magic. It means that her offensive toolkit as a mage is significantly limited. Now, granted, I'm not exactly a huge fan of Reason magic for offenses in this game anyway, but Manuela's other options are severely limited. Unlike Hanneman, she doesn't have a free path into a physical class that can make up for her shortcomings, instead choosing to focus on swords, which don't really grant access to any good classes. This does come with a single magical sword combat art, Hexblade, which means that she can use her better attacking stat to deal damage, and because swords are typically the less competed over weapon types, it's not unreasonable for Manuela to have a de facto monopoly on all of the best swords in the game, such as Rapier and Devil Sword. But how much is Hexblade actually doing for her? It adds +7 damage and allows her to use magic and hit on resistance, which gives a little bit of a boost depending on what class you're attacking. But Manuela's magic stat is also not that great. She boasts a base of 14 with a 40% growth rate. And like, this is 3 houses, stats only matter to a certain degree, you can fix them by reclassing into classes with good base stats, but still, having this low numbers is not exactly a great selling point for Manuela to be your magical sword combat art user. And speaking of her low magic, let's revisit Warp. In Fire Emblem 3 Houses, Warp allows you to take an adjacent ally and send them across the map. The maximum distance you can send them being your magic stat divided by 4. Since Manuela has a base magic of 14, this means that she can only send people 3 spaces. This is still better than the movement skills like Swap and Reposition, since it can move you more spaces and it can potentially get someone over walls. But a warp range of 3 is pretty bad. Like, there are plenty of strategies that you can execute with a low warp range. A famous one is in Chapter 5, sending someone over the wall in order to kill Miklon without having to deal with anything else in the big long hallway. But even outside of circumstances where the geography presents a specific wall or river you want to get over, you can use Warp to just effectively increase someone's range if you're going for a one-turn boss kill. Maybe you've strided them but they're still 2 tiles short, Warp can help make up the difference. As a result, if Manuela were your only option for Warp, or even just one of your earliest options, then I would consider her to be quite good. A lower range Warp is definitely worse than a higher range Warp, but you can still find application for it. But not only is Manuela not the first Warper you get, she is easily the latest Warper you get. By the time she joins in Chapter 8, it's not unreasonable to have all 3 of the other Warp candidates reach the crucial spell. And Manuela doesn't even have Warp at base. You still have to train her White Magic rank. In order to get from B rank to A rank, you need 640 points of skill experience. Because Manuela has a boon in White Magic, she'll gain extra every week that she studies it. On normal mode, this equates to 32 skill experience, on hard it's 28, and on maddening it is a mere 24. This means that if left to her own devices, on normal mode it takes 10 weeks for her to get from B rank to A rank. That's 2.5 chapters. I'm a huge fan of movement tech, but getting a 3-range warp in Chapter 10 of 3 Houses just doesn't feel like high-tier material to me. And remember, that's the timeline for normal mode. On Hard and Maddening, warp comes online even later for Manuela. If we want to place the Infirmary Master on our team, we're going to have to find a way to speed this up, and thankfully there are a few mechanics to do so. The freest way to do this is to make sure that Manuela focuses only on faith. For those who aren't aware, when you instruct your units in 3 houses to study, you can either give them 1 area or 2 areas to study in. If they study both areas, then both of them will increase at the normal rate. But if they only study 1, they will increase that 1 area at 1.5 times speed. For most characters, I would say it's generally recommended to focus on 2 separate areas because most characters need to hit multiple ranks both for their intended classes and potentially to unlock specific skills or combat arts. However, in the case of Manuela, faith is really the only thing she has going for her. So it feels almost cost-free to just have her doubly focus on faith. Sure, this means that she's definitely not getting to bolting, but if we're being honest, with a Reason Bane, she wasn't going to get that anyway. By giving Manuela a 1.5 times boost, this means that on normal mode, she actually gets warp in Chapter 9, and in maddening mode, she will hit it in Chapter 10. However, we can potentially make this even faster if we spend some of our lecture points tutoring Manuela. I would consider this to be an investment cost because everyone in 3 houses wants to build some number of skill ranks, and most of your units are not going to be able to reach the benchmarks you want for their builds unless you focus on tutoring them. By the time Manuela is recruitable, Byleth's professor rank is probably high enough that you can tutor most but not all of your students in a single week. So if you want to make room for Manuela in this tutoring schedule, it is going to screw over the build potential of some of your other team members. Personally, I don't think she justifies the tutoring sessions, especially if you have other warpers on your team. If you're doing a challenge run where she's your only potential warper, like a faculty-only run or a draft race, then she might be worth this investment, but in standard play, I think it is unlikely. Still, if you have her focus on faith exclusively, she will hit warp by Chapter 10, which means she can be part of your warp squad going into Part 2, which is where it is at its most valuable anyway. And like I said just a few minutes ago, it's basically free to have her only focus on faith. There's not really any other skills she wants to make use of in her build, right? Yeah, that was a lie. YouTuber lying moment. So, at the same time that you unlock Manuela and Hanneman, you unlock their paralog, Oil and Water. In it, both characters are force deployed and game overs, and Manuela starts far away from the rest of your team. Worse still, there are enemies that can reach her and potentially kill her. On normal and hard mode, she's probably not in much danger, although you can potentially get unlucky, especially if you take too long to get the rest of your army over there. But on maddening mode, it is damn near essential to have her on a flying mount so that she can get away from the people who want to kill her. Thankfully, Manuela starts with D rank in flying, so you only need to raise her Lance rank in order to reclass to Pegasus, but even still, this means that she's going to want to focus on Lances. And honestly, you could potentially justify giving her a solo focus in Lances just to get Pegasus Rider as soon as possible. You can gamble it at D+, after all. The reason for this is one of the droppable items on this paralog is the Experience Gem, which gives an EXP multiplier to whoever has it equipped. Experience management is a big part of maddening mode, and while the most extreme experience management is in the early game trying to get to the intermediate classes, being able to access advanced or master classes early is still a huge boon to your army. And the sooner you get the experience gem, the sooner you can take advantage of its multiplier. Now, making Manuela into a flyer isn't the only way to beat this map. Even on maddening mode, you could have someone with rescue yoink her over to the rest of your team, or if you have enough flyers, you can just stride them and have them go over to protect her manually. But the ability for Manuela to fly out of danger makes this map significantly easier, to the extent that I would say there is a payoff for training lances on her early. which of course cuts away from some of the Faith experience. With this in mind, I think it's reasonable to assume that Manuela is probably getting Warp around the time that Part 2 begins. Depending on how much you invest in her and what your team composition is, she might get a little bit earlier, might get a little bit later, but that seems like a good estimation point for our purposes. And with that in mind, let's take a look at how Manuela's Warp works during the Part 2 maps. Okay, I lied. Let's take a quick detour to talk about Warp in Three Houses specifically, and why and how it's useful in this game. Warp is always a pretty strong tool since it allows you to move people across long distances on the battlefield. And in games like Thracia and Shadow Dragon, it is extremely centralizing because you get it early and it has infinite range, allowing you to pick and choose which maps you want to play and which ones you want to skip. Now, I know a lot of people don't like skipping maps. The argument goes, I bought the game, I want to engage with it. And if that's you, that's perfectly fine. Warp skipping is not something that everyone finds fun, and I'm not going to police how people play games. However, I do think it's fair to say that just because something isn't fun doesn't mean it isn't strong. A lot of people find Seth to be an over-centralizing and unfun way to approach Sacred Zones, at the very least in the early game. The fact that he kills everything and can't die just takes away any sense of challenge that the campaign has. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, but I also don't think it's an argument for Seth being weak. On the contrary, I think it's an argument about him being too strong, and a similar thing can be said about Warp. Three Houses saw how strong Warp was in its predecessors and tried to limit the range in the most drastic way we've done yet. It made it magic divided by 4. And on the surface, I think this is a good change. It makes it harder to just warp all the way across a large map and win the game in one turn. But unfortunately, several of the other systematic changes to Three Houses ended up directly and indirectly buffing Warp. Technically, there is the ability to farm for stat boosters in the garden, so you could buff up your warp range regardless, but I feel like that's unintended behavior and also something that you have to be kind of dedicated to abusing to do, so I'm gonna discount that. That's not really Three Houses' fault. Like, it's a low percentage chance. If you abuse the low percentage chance to rig magic stat boosters and get a big warp range, that's on you, that's not on Three Houses. What I do think is Three Houses' fault, however, is the way that they overhauled the magic system and how that impacted Warp. You see, in other games, or at least in most other games, the magic is like any other weapon or item. It has durability, and when it runs out of uses, you can't use it again for the whole game unless you repair it with a Hanneman staff. This means that in the games that I mentioned, Shadow Dragon and Thracia, while Warp is infinite, you do have a limited number of uses. And you have to, as a result, pick which maps you're going to skip and which maps you're going to engage with. Now, these games didn't always get the numbers right. For example, in Shadow Dragon, it's basically possible to skip 90% of the maps, given how many uses of Warp and Hanneman you have available. And Thracia faces a similar problem, but at least on the surface, this makes it so you have to pick and choose which maps you're going to jump over. Later games in the series would also give you Warp much later into the campaign. Fire Emblems 6 and 8 give their Warp in the desert map that marks around the halfway point of the campaign, and Fire Emblem 7 has an extremely late Warp stat, to the point that there's basically only 3 maps that you want to use it on anyway. The magic system in Three Houses unfortunately bucks both of these trends. Your characters learn their spells based on their skill rank in both Faith and Reason, which means that you can pump out Warp incredibly quickly if you know which characters to tutor in Reason. Cynthia can get it in time for Chapter 5, and the others get it not too soon afterwards. Additionally, rather than being consumable items that break and they're done, these are instead charges that you get to use a certain number of times per map. In the case of Warp, you only get 1 use per map, unless you're in the Bishop or Grimoire class, in which case you get 2, but oftentimes 1 use is enough. And since you get to use it every single map, there's now no longer a debate as to whether or not it's worth using Warp on this map. If you have a way to warp someone and kill the boss in order to end the map, then the only thing stopping you from doing so is you finding that to be unfun. However, even if you don't want to warp skip maps, I would argue warp is still a powerful tool in your arsenal. It's probably not worth a deployment slot on its own at this point, but if you have a unit you're deploying anyway, then you might as well give them the ability to send someone halfway across the map, either for emergency situations or as part of your plan. Maybe instead of killing the boss, you want to kill everyone, but it's still faster to send Dimitri over there with warp than it is to have him ride his horse all the way. That being said, if you're not planning on warp skipping, I do think it's recommended to either have an incredibly long-range warper or just to have warp on someone who's doing other jobs anyway. Maybe you want Cynthia because she's a glass cannon, and warp is just a bonus on top. But if the only reason you're deploying a unit is warp, then you're probably doing it for warp skips. Okay, but I just spent 5.5 minutes talking about how warp is strong in 3 houses, something that most of my audience probably agrees on, so I think at this point we can move on to zooming in on Manuela's warp specifically in the chapters after the time skip. Alright, I wanted to individually look at all of the post-time skip maps and how Manuela could contribute to them if you were trying to warp skip. I will also mention ways in which her warp is helpful if you're not trying to warp skip, but for the most part, I think you're really only deploying her as your 4th warper if you do need to warp skip. Or if you're not need to, but like if you're trying to warp skip. So, Manuela is not available on any version of Battle Before Dawn that only has in-house students, and she's neither a student nor in-house for any of the campaigns. So, the first map that she is actually available in, and this is shared amongst multiple, but I'm currently going through the Blue Lions campaign just because it was listed first. I got all of these images off of the fandom wiki. I know, ew, fandom wiki cringe, but the maps are accurate at least. So this is the Monastery Defense map. It's shared amongst all of the non-Crimson Flower campaigns. You do a Monastery Defense in Crimson Flower, but it has a different enemy layout and goal. Here, the goal is route. However, you are actually motivated to kill the boss quickly, because that will stop the infinite wave of reinforcements. You do also need to defend the defense zone, but that isn't really relevant to Manuela. She's not really doing combat. I think that since you probably only need to warp one person down there, Manuela's probably not necessary. You'd rather have a higher magic warper, or just Stride and a flyer who has the... I don't think Stride, Flyer, Leg Ring makes it in one turn, but they might with, like, if you warped a Dancer over there. In general, though, I don't think that there's much use for what I'm assuming is a 5-tile warp. On average, at this point, Manuela's going to have around 20 magic. I don't think 5 tiles adds much to you, and I think you'd much prefer a higher magic warp here. And since there is just the one boss, sending someone forward to kill them as quickly as possible is really the only significant use of warp. There's a green unit you kind of want to get to, like, this area right here. They'll set up fire, but it's arguable as to whether or not that's even good. And also, because the green unit has to get there on green unit phase, you can't just warp the green unit there, and even if you could, again, 5 tiles is not making the difference here, unless I guess to move them over. This is forested terrain that can slow them down, but in general, I don't think that warping the green unit, like, that just gets them killed by these guys. Next up is... This is the lava map, and this is also kill boss. There's just one boss here, and typically, if you are trying to warp skip this, you have a flyer so they can fly over the lava. You can stride them, and usually just one high-range warp. This is becoming a pattern, but just one high-range warp is probably enough to get them there in a single turn. If you need to, you can potentially employ 3 warpers, having one person warp your boss killer, one person warp the second warper, and the third person warp the boss killer. But in general, I think Stride plus either Wyvern or Falco is going to be enough to get there with just like a little boosty from warp. I guess the big thing is that because Manuela has a 5-tile warp with 20 magic, or 4 tile if she's got less than 20. She can effectively work as a movement skill to sort of get you out of this corner here if you want, but the other warpers, specifically like Linhardt and whatnot, can get you out of there, assuming that Cynthia as the highest magic is your high magic warper. So theoretically, she could help contribute to this as sort of like, hey, warp is just a movement skill type deal, but in practice, I think you've got so many other ways to do that on units who will be useful in other maps. This is the bridge crossing map. There are 3 bosses you need to kill, although the third one doesn't spawn until there's a zone-based line, I think around here. You get, like, attacked from behind to kill the third one. Manuela actually does... So, there's, right here, a little gap that you might want to warp someone across that is, I think, 6 tiles long. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, so that'd be 6 tiles long, because it's from the caster's position. So with a rally magic, if we have Hanneman and Manuela working together, Manuela can do a 6-tile warp to get a grounded unit over here, and this could also be useful in a non-skip context if you have a Vantage Wrath unit like Dimitri or Protection Tank Wrath, someone who you want to send over there to deal with this squad very quickly, maybe to get the chest if you care about the contents of the chest. It could be useful for killing this, especially because getting to this boss, especially if you're trying to do it quickly, is going to take multiple movement skills, and you might actually need to employ 3 warpers just to get someone over here. Like I said with the Volcano map, you warp your boss killer, you warp your second warper, and then you have the second warper warp the boss killer again so that they can reach the boss. And if you have 3 warpers contributing that way, then the third guy over here, you either need to, like, I guess you could have, like, a Dark Flyer rescue, or Manuela's warp with rally magic from Hanneman can make this distance. So this is sort of the first instance of Manuela, I would say, actively contributing to a potential warp skip. And it has, applications outside of specifically warp skipping. This is the Battle of Eagle and Lion number 2. The only 2 bosses to kill are here, and again, we are going to probably either employ, like, significant movement tools or multiple warpers in order to get over to, this would be Edelgard. This will be either Dimitri or Claude, depending on which route you are on. And this probably just needs a stride plus a warp, but to get to Edelgard specifically, if you're trying to do her very quickly, you're probably going to want to stack multiple warpers on top of each other. Or you could use a Dark Flyer with Rescue. And this is, again, another instance in which Manuela could potentially be useful, just because of the significant distance between Edelgard and your starting position. So, again, if you are specifically trying to, like, take out both Claude/Dimitri and Edelgard on the same turn, and you want to do it on turn 1, which, is a pretty difficult map. There's pretty threatening enemies on Maddening mode. It's not an unreasonable thing to want to do. The 5-tile warp could potentially be the difference maker in reaching the boss there. This is, because we're on the Blue Lions campaign, I believe this is retaking the capital. And it's just one boss right, or no, this is not retaking the capital. Which one is this? Yeah, this is retaking the capital. There's just one boss here, and very easy warp skip. Doesn't really require anything other than one warper, potentially even just, like, using stride and leg ring. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yeah, you probably need other movement tools. But this is not a particularly difficult boss to reach, and I think Manuela contributes too much here. The Claude map, similar story. It's a kill boss again, and the boss is right here. Just a big warper and a stride can get you over there. I guess, so, if you don't have a flyer, it could be a little bit tricky because of the way that the enemies are laid out. You would kind of need pass. But if you do have a flyer, just fly over these walls. Again, Manuela's not going to be your go-to in that situation. Someone who can sort of get you over here and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yes, you really only need to get, like, in here. Manuela's not helping too much if you're trying to specifically warp skip here, and if you're playing quote-unquote honestly, like I said, she doesn't really have much to offer other than warp. This is a... Is this kill multiple bosses? No, this is just kill one boss. This is... Oh, this is the fortress. This is the fortress map. This map is... Again, like, Manuela's 4 tiles are not contributing too much if you're just trying to warp skip on this map. You have long movement, you have flyers to get over the walls, you have much longer warp. Even if you do need to warp a warper, you've got 3 other options and they're all going to have longer distance than Manuela. So she's, again, not really doing too much for this particular skip. I guess if you care about the chests, she could help warp someone with a chest key over there, but there's just not much that she has to offer. This is entering the capital, and this is another one where the boss, Hubert, right here, is very, very far away from your starting position. So as a result, a warp chain plus stride is not unreasonable. And while I don't necessarily think you need the 4th warper for that, you could potentially run into a situation where you don't really have the tools, like the movement tools necessary without Manuela's help. I can see her being useful here. Another thing of note is that this is a map where silence can be a big deal. You'll notice that there's some isolated mages that she might want to silence. Hubert, you can't silence because of his, like, thing. But there's some isolated mages that you can silence with Manuela to allow protection tanks to more easily take on, like, specific groups of enemies. Up here, there's one tome user here. So it could be... Silence can be useful here. That's really the only other tool in Manuela's arsenal. And this is sort of the first... Obviously, it's useful on other maps, but this is one where it's most notable to me initially, at least within Blue Lions. And then Blue Lions endgame, because Heavan Edelgard has multiple health bars, you can potentially want to do... Like, you might want to take advantage of multiple warpers to get multiple boss killers up there. She is a very dangerous enemy if left alive, obviously. Well, if left alive at all times, because once you kill her, the map is done, right? But I can see Manuela's warp helping out in this situation at the same time. 5 or 6 tiles is not typically going to be the difference maker. I guess you could send someone over this wall, like send another warper over this wall. I'd be on this side so that you don't get blocked by the monster in order to warp someone else into the throne room. Sort of like the warp chain type deal, but it's hard to do, like, it's hard to justify using Manuela as part of the warp chain when you have 3 other people who could do the warp chain with more flexibility because of their higher magic. Moving on to maps that are only in Golden Deer and Silver Snow. So this is the one where you kill the Death Knight and then he respawns and starts running away. Because you have to kill the boss twice, there is a greater need for multiple warpers. But because your starting position is close enough that you probably only need 1 warper each time, I don't really see Manuela, like, as part of a warp chain being super useful here. Potentially, you could have, like, your best warper warp someone the first time and then do a 3-person warp chain to get the second one, but I think in most situations, that's not going to be super necessary. It is nice and helpful, but, like to have it as an option, but otherwise, this is another one where you can see, like, scattered tome users that potentially silence could be useful on. Although up here, like, Claude isn't really protection tanking. He's more like Vantage Wrath tanking if he's doing any sort of enemy phase build. So I'm not sure that silence would super help out here. But like down here, like this group, well, I guess there's 2 of them there. Silence can be helpful here, but it's not super high value. This is the Underground City map. This is also in Verdant Wind and Silver Snow. You could potentially justify Manuela because you need to warp someone to open the door and someone to kill the boss, but unfortunately, given the layout, it's hard to do warp chains. You would have to have, like, just 2 warpers instead of the 3. And you can't really do warp chains with just 3 people, right? Because who are you warping? Like, you warp a warper, then you warp the boss killer. It's harder to do. I can see it potentially, but I think it makes more sense. Like, I don't think Manuela does much here. Again, I think the higher magic warpers are doing more for you in this situation. This is... Now we're moving on to the Edelgard route, Crimson Flower. No. This is the endgame of... Right. This is not Edelgard route. This is the endgame of Golden Deer. This has the 12 lords. So this is a map that you're probably not warp skipping. The sort of cheesy warp strategy is Luna, Lysithea, ignore the rest of the bosses because Luna doesn't care about the enemy's stats. And in that case, you are taking one of your warpers off the table, and so if you want 3 people to warp Lysithea over there, Manuela is helpful for that. But I generally find that strategy, while it is funny, it's not super feasible. You have to farm, especially on maddening mode, you have to farm a ridiculous number of magic boosters. So I think that it makes more sense to try to kill the 12 elites before, or at least some number of the 12 elites before taking on Nemesis. And if you're doing that, you're not really warp skipping, and Manuela's not really helping that much for that. So I think this is another map that's kind of a dud for her, because, like, I guess she could warp someone a couple of tiles to kill an elite, but, like, I'd much rather have someone who can do competent combat on this map against the elites. This is... So now we're on to the Edelgard maps. This is the bridge map, but from the opposite perspective. It's another, kill multiple bosses situation, but again, Manuela's not doing much for you here because there's not a super long distance to do. There's not even, like, here I sort of copiumed with this gap, but there's not really this gap here. Oh no, this doesn't even kill multiple bosses, is it? You just have to kill the one. The girl whose name I can't remember, who for some reason isn't recruitable in Golden Deer, only she feels like she should be, you kill her. This is Kill Claude. This is another one where it's pretty long distance, so you could justify doing a warp chain, but the more common strategy, and this is kind of why on Edelgard route, having multiple warpers has very decreasing usefulness, is Amir Raging Storm kind of negates the need to do warp chains. You can just warp Edelgard, like, even if you can't get her all the way to Claude, she can kill one of these guys. It doesn't even have to, you can just attack one of these guys to Raging Storm and make it to Claude and then kill Claude. And this is, you could, do a warp chain here, but even if you did, do you really need Manuela in that for the +5 range when you could use any of the other 3 warpers together? The Monastery Defense in Edelgard's route is slightly different. Instead of being route, it is just kill boss, and so now there is a reason to want a warper on this side as well as warpers over here to kill these bosses. In this instance, I can potentially see Manuela being helpful for, I guess, this one up here. I think that's Cyril, is the closest boss, because that's Seth, that's Flame, yeah, so that's Cyril. And... Oh, wait, no, I think that's, Oh, because Catherine's on this map, too, I want to say. Catherine dies on this map. Regardless, there's 3 bosses. It doesn't matter which story characters they are. I can see Manuela being useful if you've, like, strided this group, and then you can do, like, a 4 range warp to get over to here, but Not on this side, because this side you really want someone with longer range to get over the forest to get to this boss over here. Yeah, it's, I can see Manuela being useful here, but it's not likely. This is... Which one is... Oh, yeah, this is, the capital. This is the capital of the Empire. So this is a big map. There's 5 bosses, although 2 of them are optional because 2 of them, it's Felix and not Mercedes, I think Annette. If you've recruited them, then they're replaced by generics who do not count as commanders. But you do have to kill Rodrigue, you have to kill, a couple other people. This is a big one where every last movement tool you have counts. And this is another, small gap, small warp range can get you to this boss, while you have your bigger warp ranges focus on the farther away ones, and potentially stride to take care of these ones. If you are trying to 1-turn or 2-turn or low-turn this map, Manuela will actually contribute to any sort of skip here. This is the field where you kill Dimitri, Dedu, and I think that's Ferdinand von Ayer over here? No, it wouldn't be because he's Black Eagle. Sylvain. I always get them confused with each other. So there's 3 bosses here, although one of them you can recruit away to not have to deal with. And, it's another one where because there's 3 bosses, I can potentially see the low movement warp, especially if you just want to go over the water, send someone over the water to deal with this boss being useful. It's also worth noting that Deju can turn into a monster, which would require more people to deal with if you allow that to happen. I think that's turn-based, might be zone-based, but either way, it does mean that sending multiple people up there is useful, although Manuela can... I guess she can send people across the river is the big thing that she could do with her lower warp range. And that's useful even if you're not trying to skip, just because I find that the watery terrain here is pretty annoying to deal with. And then we have the final map. Final map is just Rhea. Rhea, you potentially want to send multiple people towards, although you could just have Edelgard kill every health bar with Raging Storm if your Edelgard is strong enough. The problem with trying to do, like, warp chains here is half of your army is over here. It's kind of awkward. I don't really know what these guys are supposed to be contributing to the main cause. I think the idea is they just, like, go around like this and get Rhea from the side, but I'd much rather everyone be together, because the flames make it hard for mounted units who aren't flying to get reunited with the army. This is one where, I guess, again, you could do a warp chain. Manuela could contribute to a warp chain. I've been saying that for a lot of these maps. But if you're doing a warp chain, unless you need all 4 warpers together, I just don't see what a 4 magic person is doing for you. I'd much rather, again, like, because this is also one where you could have, because in 2 maps prior, this is the map where you can repair Amir, right? You're likely to have a good number of Raging Storms available, and Raging Storm can just make up the difference if you're 4 tiles short, way more easily than Manuela can. And it's the final map, so, like, you don't have to care about the durability, unless you don't have enough Amirs to also take on Rhea, which is possible, but I can see Manuela being useful here. Maybe silence some of the, like, annoying mages, but, like, it's not much. It's really not much. Okay, so hopefully from highlighting the different maps, I've shown that for the most part, Manuela is neither necessary nor helpful in 1-turn skips, although there are a few where her low warp range can help contribute to some very fast clears. I would argue that even in those instances, there are alternate tools that you can make use of, but, I mean, you could say that about almost any Fire Emblem character, so I don't think that's the stellar counter-argument to Manuela being useful that it appears to be. Instead, I would say that all she has to offer is the worst warp in the game, and even in the context of skipping maps, I don't find that to be terribly useful. In fact, her reason boon holds her back even within the role of just being a warper. Despite the fact she starts with enough flying rank for it, Dark Flyer is difficult to attain because it requires reason rank. And even though Manuela is female, it's unlikely on the higher difficulties to get her to Gremory in a reasonable time frame. This means that she's stuck as a 4-move warper, which is not the worst fate in the world. Linhardt has to deal with that as well, but at least Linhardt has physic access to make up for his abysmal move. Happy and Cynthia can also offer you things beyond their warp value. Happy's personal skill is very abusable when it comes to monsters, and her spell list is pretty alright as well, and Cynthia has one of the best spell lists in the game, alongside a bonkers magic stat. While there absolutely are some people that exaggerate her glass cannon potential, things like Luna and Dark Spikes are legitimately useful in situations that other reason mages struggle. For the most part, enemy resistance and tome weight makes it difficult for mages to one-round on Maddening, but Cynthia can legitimately find situations where she does so. And if you're deploying her to be a warp bot anyway, the ability to contribute in other manners is just gravy on top. At the end of the day though, Manuela is able to contribute to some one-turn clears of maps, so the question is, does that make her good? And I would argue yes, but also no. So like, having a place, even a somewhat replaceable place in these one-turn clears is a nice claim to fame, and more than units like Ash and Anna can say. But if you're not pushing the turn count of 3 houses maps to its absolute minimum, then Manuela doesn't really have much to offer you. If someone were to approach me and ask if they should include Manuela on their maddening or even hard team, I would say no, and it's not because she's a particularly complex unit to use. In fact, I would say Manuela is one of the simplest units to use. She has exactly one tool and the game funnels you towards it. It's just that outside of highly specific scenarios, that one tool isn't super useful. While Manuela probably isn't the worst unit in 3 Houses cast, I think that she is at least of the caliber to belong in the conversation. Warp is an incredibly powerful and meta-centralizing tool, but Manuela just doesn't have enough going for her for Warp to save her from the dregs of low-tier hell. But like, what even does low-tier hell mean? I mean, 3 Houses has probably the strongest cast in the series, with the exception of maybe Conquest. So if you're one of the worst units in 3 Houses, it doesn't make you unusable even by any stretch of the imagination. While I think her inclusion on the roster would weaken your overall team quality, if you're a fan of Manuela's characterization, or her design, or just feel like using her for whatever reason, I'm not gonna stop you. Despite having a very challenging highest difficulty, 3 Houses as cast is at least flexible enough that you can make any combination of them work. So, I'm not really sure what the point of this video was, other than, I guess, just an excuse to dunk on the fact that the teachers suck. But you know who doesn't suck? Yes, that is what I'm going for with my segue. My patrons! So thank you to Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Carosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Saxon, Reflect, Marin McLean, Calamity Callie, Queen Elizam, Adele, Thaythom, Andu, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Danielle Kalaskis, Arvis, Belle Wenska, Dysyke, Joseph Needing, Tailored Muffin, George Granville the 7th PM, SUP, Caius Cole, Gabe the Green, Control Aegis, Joanna the Renchwitz, Ginger, and especially my Jagans, Autumn Kelsey, and Julia Kyoto. If you are interested in supporting the channel, there is a link to do so below. Benefits include things like early videos, polls to influence the outcome of the channel, and even some stuff that's a little bit too spicy to mention on YouTube. But please, 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 only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. If you don't have the means or desire to spend money, then that's fine. I would appreciate a like and subscribe on the video. But regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.